So without further ado, if I might now hand over to Carmody for her seminar presentation entitled Environment and Autonomy.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you everybody for being here. It's really, really nice to be with you all. It's really nice to see lots of familiar faces, and particular greetings to former and present Durhamites. It feels like a long time since I've been in Durham, but it's really, really nice to be in a slightly Durham gathering as well as an Oxford gathering. And I'm very grateful in advance, in particular, for you, I hope, feeding back profusely and freely on what I'm going to say. I'm exploring some very new territory for me today. Sorry, the door's blowing up. And this is really my first attempt to put words to some of these lines of inquiry that I've been pursuing over the past months, since Christmas, really. This work originated in an invitation from Australian Catholic University to be part of their Redeeming Autonomy program. When I first got that invitation, I was baffled because I thought to myself, I have no idea. I mean, I just about know how to spell it, and that's pretty much it. And I didn't know why I was invited to do that. But as I've started to reflect on it and read and write, it's become richer and richer and has intersected with so many other things that I'm doing, and I think probably that you're all doing. So that's the kind of origin of this piece of work. And it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to process it with you in a relatively when they start building a house and all there is stuff sticking up from the ground and a big mess. It feels a bit like that in my head. I've tried to put some kind of order into it so that it's not as messy as it's been for me, and that's been a useful process. But that's what you're getting today. I'm going to speak, I hope, for not more than 35 minutes, and I really look forward to hearing what you all have to say. So what I was asked to do by the Redeeming Autonomy program, for the Redeeming Autonomy program, is look in particular at the intersection between issues of environment and issues of autonomy. And that's apposite because, as it dawned on me very quickly that in contemporary environmental discourse, the concept of autonomy has become very problematic. It's particularly loaded with negative connotations in environmental philosophy and theology. I think there are two related aspects to this suspicion, the suspicion in which it's held. The first is, this is no doubt very obvious, but I'm just going to trot through it anyway. The first is that the Western valorization of autonomy appears to be closely allied to dualism, the dualism which sees human beings as discontinuous from the wider natural order, and in theory separable from it. And associated with that dualism is rationalism. The classical Enlightenment account of autonomy in Kant and Descartes takes human rationality to be its ground, the ground of autonomy, and assumes, or is thought to assume, the supremacy of a disembodied rational spirit over irrational flesh, and the reduction of the physical to pure extension, pure matter, and the contraction of meaning into mind, and all those kind of narratives that we're quite familiar with. Ecofeminism, of course, has been a particularly vigorous voice in identifying the problems with that narrative. So that's one reason for the suspicion in which autonomy is held. It's association with dualism and rationalism. The second aspect of that suspicion, I think, is that there's seen to be an internal relationship between an account of the self as autonomous and of humanity in general as autonomous from nature with anthropocentrism. Seeing human beings as autonomous seems to underpin that kind of false sense of human independence from how things go with the wider natural environment, which actually fuels ecological degradation. So there's that general picture of a suspicion in which notions of autonomy are held, and the foregrounding, as I see it, of ontologies of codependence and relationality and mutuality across the whole of the environmental philosophy and theology field, I think it reflects an obvious desire to correct that anthropology. The language of contemporary environmentalism is just sort of saturated with notions of interdependence. So going back to John Muir's famous claim that everything in the universe is hitched to everything else, the clarion call of dependence is maybe I think one of the defining moral motifs of green rhetoric. In that connection, the notion of ecology, I think, does a lot of work. So the moralization of ecology across all kinds of different discourses generates a sense that this mutual dependence, this interconnectedness is not just a sort of fact, not just an inert fact, but actually a moral norm. Interestingly, it has this role and has increasingly gained this role, particularly in Catholic social teaching, with Laudato Si being the most prominent example, of course, with its constant refrain that everything is connected. And to state the very obvious, this kind of discourse about mutual dependence and interconnection, counterposed to a notion of a false autonomy or a false independence, is actually emergent from the founding impetus of the whole environmental movement, which is a sense of human vulnerability to changes in the natural environment, or in other words, humanity's non-autonomy from nature. So taking a kind of very generalistic snapshot, both the cause and the solution to, or correct response to environmental crisis are parsed in terms that seem intrinsically to sponsor the rejection of notions of autonomy. And at the level of metaphysics and ethics in environmentalist discourse, autonomy is seen to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. So in this paper, I want to sketch an outline of an argument as to why environmental discourse, and in particular our capacity to adequately handle and use the notion of environmental crisis, actually depends on redeeming autonomy, or rehabilitating, if you like, a notion of autonomy. Yes, from some of its history, but also from an environmental movement that I think is a bit captivated by an oversimple account of the causes and consequences of environmental change. And I think this examination allows us to notice a few things. Firstly, how much is at stake in the way that we conceptualize that change, environmental change. Secondly, that we need to pay more attention to the moral architecture that our conceptualizations presume and require. And thirdly, how pervasive is the foundational philosophical problem of environmental discourse altogether, which is that an account of what it is to be a human being and an account of what it is to be natural simply can't be separated. And this issue of autonomy, I think, or the possible role of autonomy crystallizes that. So to begin by talking about the notion of crisis, obviously the notion of environmental crisis has become idiomatic. We use it to designate the scale and the pace and the effects of what's changing around us. And the concept of crisis is really pivotal in the way that environmental phenomena are constructed in our media. So climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and so on. And this language just trips off the tongue without causing anyone to pause. But the idiom of crisis actually contains a narrative which deserves some examining. Because the way, to state the obvious again, the way in which we describe what is happening is, of course, itself an interpretation of what is happening. The recent decision by, well, it's not that recent anymore, decision by some media organizations to stop talking about crisis and start talking about emergency represents a sort of partial admission of that how we describe what is happening expresses certain conceptualizations of the situation, and so evokes certain kinds of response as being appropriate or not appropriate. To get a bit of a sense of this is something I like to remind students of. We can note that there would be an obvious alternative description of what's happening, no less loaded, but differently loaded to the planet. We could just call it environmental change. Not all changes are crises. Choosing to describe a change as a crisis, choosing to describe this change as a crisis, represents a decision to take the change as having a certain significance and as calling for a certain kind of response. So what's conveyed by the term crisis as a mode of description of what is happening? As readers of the Greek New Testament know, the word conveys something like a moment of both judgment and decision. It captures both the sense of conviction, in that sense of being indicted for something, and also of discernment, of a weighing and measuring. So it connotes a choice, a fork in the road, indicating a definitive action, which creates a particular future. In that sense, it represents an event of confrontation with more than one possible way forward. So a moment of decision which is of weight, of consequence, and additionally, I think a moment of truth in the sense of an exposure to what is really there. All of those layers are present in the New Testament meaning of the term. Of course, semantics have changed, and the word in English now has more of the character of something very bad is happening, which puts in question a great deal that is important. And it carries the sense of urgency and threat. But contemporary usage, I think, does reflect the history of the word, the etymology of the word, with its implications of judgment, because we all intuitively grasp that a crisis is a moment in which we must do something. It demands response. The stakes are raised. The future is put in question. This moment in the history of humanity is a moment in which we face a choice, a decision about how we go forward, a moment which requires judgment in the sense of discernment, of weighing and measuring, and above all, a moment in which our own worth and value and capacities are exposed for what they really are, our ability to rise to this. So in the language of crisis, we are somehow capturing our own power of agency and its consequence. Language of environmental crisis, so as it will be obvious from what I've just said, the language of environmental crisis, I think, actually depends on aspects of the anthropology that the environmental discourse really wants to distance itself from. Namely, that we are subjects of responsibility because we're agents of choice. And on us, a requirement to respond is urgently imposed. And this agency effectively presupposes autonomy, human autonomy. This can be illuminated with just an obvious example. When someone swears at a computer for malfunctioning, it's usually funny and or silly, precisely because we know that the person is attributing responsibility and therefore choice where there is none. When someone blames an infant, a baby, it's not funny or silly, but a sort of moral failure. Why? Because neither an infant nor a computer are supposed realistically to have been able to do otherwise. They are not capable of judgment in the normal sense, and therefore, in an interesting semantic parallelism, they're not subject to judgment either. They're not capable of judgment, they're not subject to judgment. Something bad may happen to them, but it wouldn't be a moment of decision for them, and it won't carry any urgency, for there is no sense in expecting them to do anything, to offer any particular kind of response. And for that reason, their moral worth and value is not exposed or revealed in how they respond. In order to talk about the environmental crisis, therefore, we must operate with an assumption at some level that the adult human being per se cannot be described in the terms that would be appropriate to a computer or an infant. She is supposed to be, the adult human being is supposed to be capable of acting in a way which reflects an ability to assess the situation, to tell the difference between better and worse courses of action, and to have reasons for acting. To use a notion of environmental crisis apart from a notion of agency that contains those possibilities just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense in the sense that we couldn't be held responsible for what we are, and we couldn't be taken to have a choice in what we do. Our freedom and our ability to act on reasons, as opposed to arbitrarily or directionlessly, are invoked in the concept of crisis. We must assume, in other words, we must assume, in order to use the language of crisis, that the human being is capable of deliberative action. So action in which reasons for electing diverse ends are weighed and measured and ordered. And deliberative action is expressive of autonomy, of the human being as a self-directed agent. Without something like a notion, the classical notion of rational self-government, then the idea that we do have a choice about how we conduct ourselves, being able to marshal oneself and arraign one's environment towards ends selected as being better than other ends for objective reasons based on perceived reasons for acting, we might as well, there's no point in talking about environmental crisis. We then ought to talk about environmental tragedy. Apart from some notion of autonomy, the concept of crisis just doesn't have any traction. Those, and they are there, of course, who want to convince us that there is no role for human beings except to passively suffer the consequences of, for example, climate change, are really not talking about environmental crisis at all. They're talking about calamity, environmental calamity, a little bit in the way that someone might talk about an earthquake, a sort of act of God, which one suffers, but in which one has no agency. So it's problematic if the environmental movement or environmental discourse across the different disciplines builds itself too simply on an ideological pillorying of historic traditions of human autonomy. Such pillorying is symptomatic of, I think, the deep tension at the heart of contemporary environmentalism, which, as far as I can tell, still lacks cogent address, which is that we cannot talk convincingly about what the crisis is a crisis of if we don't have a coherent narrative of what it is to be natural or of what it is to be human. What I think this process of inquiry that I've been undertaking, what this highlights for me is that we need to have some account of the human that grounds a meaningful notion of personal agency and of the human being as capable of deliberative action. Otherwise, the arraignment of reasons for acting and exhortations to act are quite meaningless. The indefatigable presentation by environmentalists of something called the science, I think, emerges from this kind of lack of care over the moral architecture that is required for facts to actually have force. The science, quote unquote, seems to speak for itself, but of course it doesn't. We can see this, to use our examples from earlier, by noticing that it's quite pointless to present the science of climate change to either a computer or an infant. They don't have any capacity for deliberative action because they are in themselves neither rational nor free in the relevant senses. And so they're not agents in the relevant sense. What they lack is precisely the autonomy that would make it possible to reflectively deliberate on the science and make decisions about what to do about it, how to conduct themselves differently because of it, on the basis of certain values, perceived values. So to conclude this part of the paper, without a sense of the self as an autonomous agent capable of deliberative action, our conceptualization of what is happening around us as a crisis will just be toothless. And to now indicate where I want to go with this in the second half of this paper, this conception of the self has generally been sacrificed in contemporary environmental discourse because of the urgency of re-establishing the interdependence of human beings with the wider natural order. But this interdependence, which environmental discourses prize, is not incompatible with autonomy, and nor are the wider lines of critique of historic traditions of autonomy irrelevant or unfounded. Historic traditions of autonomy, of course, call for very close interrogation and reframing, just as historic framings of reason and freedom do. Redeeming autonomy doesn't mean re-enthroning a self-sufficient Homo sapiens, which indifferently transcends nature, or propagating a kind of naive picture of the human mind as uninfluenced by the body or the world. Redeeming autonomy in this context, I think, means, among other things, recognizing the centrality of autonomy to a moral architecture which we cannot actually do without, which we in fact can do without less than ever, while at the same time not fantasizing about possibilities of reason and freedom and agency as completely indifferent to materiality or dependence or the constitution of the self by others, human and non-human, of course. It's simply a mistake to suppose that if we take materiality and sociality and dependence seriously, then we cannot sustain a language of autonomy. Rather, what we need to do is ask what kind of account of autonomy would be adequately responsive to contemporary ecology, environmental philosophy, eco-theology, and so on. In terms used by Kwame Anthony Appiah, the political philosopher, who's been very helpful as I think about this, we need to posit both a self with the freedom to create itself and to make its own choices, and a self that's shaped in relation to collective contexts and identities and influences. It's both and. So that concludes the first half of the paper. The second half is an attempt to connect this concept of autonomy with some different trajectories, some of which make it possible and some of which make it less possible to conceptualize autonomy helpfully. In the early modern period, accounts of human autonomy, of course, or of human being, traded explicitly on a metaphysics of nature, what we might call a metaphysics of nature. So the general modern account of nature associated with a Bacon or a Descartes, of course, deserves the kind of interrogation that it's had, but the connection that they made is necessary. We do need to have a metaphysics of nature because the human being is construable only in relation to its putative context. I mean, at the most simple level. Some of the most well-known and influential strands of contemporary environmental philosophy are, of course, founded on the perception that we need just this, a new metaphysics of nature, in order to sustain an alternative to the modern conceptualization of the self. The interest of these accounts is usually, as I've been saying, to restore the sense of human dependence on and insertion into nature, the wider natural context. And as I said, I think that instinct is correct, but too often these new metaphysics of nature sacrifice autonomy for interconnectedness. So I'll mention a couple of examples, too briefly. Sorry, these are very sketchy and probably caricatured, but you can challenge me on this shortly. Deep ecology for example, recognizes that a metaphysics of nature and of the self need to be seen as internally related. It contends that, this is a quote, the most urgent task of eco-philosophy is the articulation of a new understanding of the self. It's well known for its rejection of modernity's language of independence and individuality, and advocates for a panpsychist monism, basically, in which human beings feature only as expressions of a cosmic self. That's very far down the panpsychist monistic end of the spectrum, but there's a sort of more intermediate position would be represented by somebody, maybe some of you know her work and can correct me, my description of this, but might know it better than me. A more mediating position is taken by someone like Freya Matthews, whose 1991 book, The Ecological Self, tried to develop a new account of human selfhood and agency to take seriously the metaphysical implications of ecology. And this really is a good example of the moralization of ecology, taking interconnectedness as a moral norm, which she does. And she also proposes a panpsychist monism of a Spinozan sort, but tries to resist deep ecology's erasure of the self, of the individual. But her account of the individual is really overdetermined by her rejection of the kind of imperialist autonomy of Baconian man. And so her metaphysics of interconnectedness really, I think, is capable of enshrining a notion of personal agency. So that's one set of examples, deep ecology and a kind of near neighbor to deep ecology, where a metaphysics of nature is not adequate. The metaphysics of nature is not adequate to defend a notion of personal autonomy. Another example is so-called religious naturalism, which seeks to characterize it generally to find religious meaning in naturalistic accounts of reality, scientific naturalist accounts. It takes actually a similar path. It posits a pure nature without transcendence, but in the end, it grants a complete authority to scientific epistemology as providing a picture of the universe as a kind of single self-contained natural system that doesn't really have any room for reason or freedom in the classical sense, and therefore no room for agency either. I was going to make some comments at this point about the very fascinating parallels between deep ecology and religious naturalism and scientific naturalism, but I won't because we're a bit short of time. But I think that they all metaphysically converge, even though they sort of the outcomes look different, but I think the underlying metaphysics is very similar. What they have in common that's of concern to our discussion now is that I think all three sacrifice on the altar of renaturalizing the human any account of the human being as capable of deliberative action, even though that account of the human being is actively presupposed by the notion of environmental crisis. In targeting modernity's self, the modern subject, as the culprit, while at the same time passively assuming and redeploying modernity's language of moral responsibility, I think that they solve the branch that they're sitting on, really. So, sorry that was so brief, but it gives you a sense of what the shape of my concern is about certain kinds of environmental discourse, certain kinds of environmental philosophy. So having identified some trajectories which I think don't sustain a robust account of autonomy, I'd like to identify, and sorry, this is not more constructive, but it's a beginning. I'd like to identify some conversation partners for a construction of human agency, which respects some of these concerns in environmental philosophy and theology, while actually maintaining the space for something like freedom and rationality, which classically found human agency as a space for deliberative action. So the first is, perhaps predictably, is Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor has become very well known for his surprising defense of the modern subject, which has otherwise received a bit of a battering in recent decades. So Taylor argues that in placing the accent on inwardness and subjectivity, the modern self offers unique possibilities for freedom and self-realization. He is, of course, himself not typically modern in the accepted sense, because he recognizes that the self is always constructing and reconstructing itself in relation to a perceived good. So he doesn't regard the self as a given, but he does attribute a kind of normativity internal to the self by stipulating it as definitively oriented towards perceived goods. because he thinks that the self is continually being constructed and reconstructed in relation to that horizon of the good, Taylor thinks that it's not mere description when we describe the self. It actually generates possibilities of action. Our account of the self actually generates possibilities of action. So in his account, ideas don't just abruptly shift from right to wrong. They actually evolve gradually through identification of areas of weakness. And they, at the same time, resolve prior problems while at the same time generating new problems and challenges. The thing that's important there, I'm about to say another thing about his understanding of autonomy, but the thing that's important there is that he thinks that the way we think about the self to some extent determines what we think, what we're actually able to do. That our ideas about the self actually have constructive power. So with that in mind, he seeks to give an account of autonomy as embedded in and constituted by social and material practices, a bit like MacIntyre, and as oriented internally and necessarily towards conceptualizations of the good that transcends the self. And in defending the inwardness of the modern subject, he creates a space for deliberative action, for a notion of the human being as capable of deliberative action, but he does that without seeking to free the self from its context, material or social. So this sort of account, very roughly, takes some of the concerns of contemporary environmental philosophy and theology as central, so the re-embedding of the self in networks of dependence, while at the same time foregrounding a sense of human agency as an interior space from which deliberative action emerges. He points out controversially, and it's still controversial, even though this particular bit of work is from some time ago, that while individualism is in some cases a pernicious force, it has actually opened up particular cultural and intellectual possibilities. And one of them, of course, is the notion of human rights, which by extension has opened up the possibility of talking about rights altogether, which is of enormous environmental relevance, obviously, and moral relevance more generally. And as Appiah says, one of the characteristic achievements of a discourse of autonomy is actually to protect a social order of individuals who are to be treated as ends in the kind of Kantian sense, and whose freedom for personal deliberative action and self-cultivation demands protection and respect. So it has a very concrete political effect, a discourse of autonomy framed in this way. So that's Taylor. Drawing to a close very, very shortly. The most cogent, I think, recent account of what deliberative action actually looks like is offered by the Kantian moral philosopher Christine Korsgaard. So her first attempt at that was in The Sources of Normativity, 1996. And more recently in her very excellent the book is called Self-Constitution, Agency, Identity and Integrity, 2009. She really tries to she tries to picture exactly what autonomy means concretely in terms of human decision making, and I think she does a fantastic job of it. The reason I'm mentioning her now, aside from that, is that in her most recent book, Fellow Creatures, 2018, she actually tries to show that that kind of account of autonomy doesn't in any way mean supposing that human beings are discontinuous from their natural context. She talks about a kind of graduated degrees of autonomy found throughout the natural order, and that a notion of autonomy of this kind doesn't in any way need to isolate or elevate the human unduly from a kind of family resemblance with other organisms. And therefore, a language of autonomy doesn't have to represent this kind of feared contraction of reason and freedom and meaning into a sort of human enclave. So I'd like to say more about her, but for reasons of time, I won't. The final person I want to mention is Jonas, Hans Jonas, the philosopher, Jewish philosopher, and I'll try and explain briefly why. At the heart of what makes talk of an environmental crisis meaningful, I think, is something like an issue of teleology. We need to ask and go on asking that very neglected question, what is it that we want to sustain? As I've argued, the talk of crisis is somehow founded on the supposition that we've got to do something, that there is some response that we want to make, and therefore reasons for acting and some goals towards which we want to move. Otherwise, the moment of decision is just arbitrary. If there's no goal and no agency, then there are no true actions, as Korsgaard argues. Then there's no reason for acting, and there's no shape of action. So MacIntyre, I think, Alistair MacIntyre is correct in this regard, that we need something like a new Aristotelianism which takes it as a starting point that every agent acts for a goal within time. Because without that, we can't really talk about sustainability in a meaningful sense. We can't talk about trying to achieve a sustainable future as a governing, if you like, a governing norm for adequate response to environmental crisis. If what we want to sustain is a future in which human lives, among other lives, are really possible, then we need to create conditions for autonomy, conditions for meaningful action. So the reason I mentioned Jonas is because in Jonas's very prescient work of environmental philosophy, The Imperative of Responsibility, he argues that what we want to sustain is a truly human future. That is to say, a future, and this is his expression, a future in which the idea of humanity is protected and nourished. And that requires creating the conditions for autonomy. That requires creating the conditions for real agency. And that, by the way, includes, to state the obvious, the intellectual conditions, which is, I suppose, what we're doing right now. And to head off the concerns of those of you, which I can already feel once again about the putative separation of human beings from nature that this kind of account might generate, Jonas is important precisely because his philosophical biology actually defines the freedom of the organism, and it is the organism per se, not just human organisms, but it defines the freedom of the organism as being in an existential dialectic with its environment. And that gives us a way of thinking about reason and freedom that is not rooted in human exceptionalism whatsoever, even though it recognizes that there are qualities and features and possibilities of human autonomy that are quite distinctive to Homo sapiens. So to conclude, I've tried to argue that what's at stake in the question of environmental crisis is the question of the possibility of human autonomy conceived as free reasoned agency. And what is at stake in that, in turn, is what we think a person is. Without a sense of what a person is, we cannot talk about what agency is, and we can't even talk about, I think, therefore, environmental crisis. In contemporary environmental discourse at the popular level, I sense an assumption, a completely unconscious assumption, that we can discern and act on the science in the absence of metaphysical work or metaphysical thought or metaphysical conversation, whether it's anthropological or cosmological. But as I've tried to explain, the meaning of the matter of human agency is inseparable from the question of what kind of thing we think the world is, and whether it's a world in which reason and freedom, and therefore agency, real agency, are actually possible. To summarize, in the environmental community, the hostility to the perceived collusion of liberalism and capitalism and consumerism and individualism as children of Enlightenment dualism, with its rationalism and anthropocentrism, has led to such a thoroughgoing suspicion of classical accounts of agency autonomy that the baby's really been thrown out with the bathwater. But I think it's a baby that we cannot do without. Thank you.